like
yeah,
reflectors on.
That's a good idea.
They got sorted with that.
How about through landmines?
You can walk across the green.
I wasn't going to that till David, so I thought, well,
This is the final icing on the cake, right? So we have a So we have a plaque to commemorate the fact that it's been planted because of the Queen's 70th anniversary of her reign, the Platinum Jubilee, and that will be popped in to commemorate.
Yeah, you can set it whichever you want. Yeah, thank you very much indeed.
No problem.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you.
Gentlemen, and that was
I mean, Stuart was a real hard worker.
Platinum Jubilee. Thank you.
I was asking Lewis a few moments ago, Mr. Mayor, you're not in any great hurry, but we do not want you to be delayed on your Sunday afternoon stroll out of your
We haven't got a stroll, baby.
You might have any other
Yes, we have, but I think I'll be led by Louis behind me.
Yeah.
just behind you.
I don't think we.
He's boss, we'll do as we're told.
That's all right, it's fine.
I've got it now. Is it okay?
He wants to hold it. If you're all right for a few minutes, I'll let Stuart talk to you, and I'm going up to the gate to see if anybody's arriving.
Yes.
Because we're officially opening at 1:30.
Right.
It's just about on time. So
Right.
I'd like to be there. I shall be floating around.
Okay, not an issue.
And in due course, if you'd like to come up and meet up with the city people, feel you wish to participate in the tours which start at 2 and you have the time, you're ever so welcome.
Yeah.
We'd love you to, but we understand commitments of any
That's
kind.
right.
Yes.
Your family,
Appreciate that, thank you.
friends, all sorts of things. So I hope to see you again in a few moments. Thank you very much. Thank you. See you shortly.
David, would you like 1 minute or 30 seconds of start publicity? Or
Yes,
are you
yes,
not
of
bothered?
course.
So,
But shall we do that up
yeah,
by the top?
by the top. Yeah.
And did you circulate what you filmed last August?
Yeah, you got about 400 views. Yeah. Obviously created an awareness.
That's good, thank you. And I'm glad you picked up, that we knew we were going to have this open.
And I think after last year's, downpour and that, I
Yes,
thought.
we were not very fortunate with all that rain, but people were very good at staying. Some of them were very dedicated. Do you remember?
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't video because I thought, you had had enough of the.
Yeah, I don't think.
But hopefully I can do a video today. So.
Shall I stand outside the chapel? What do you like me to do?
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea.
Just for a minute.
It's just.
Hello, good afternoon and welcome. You alright? Not till 2. We're just doing a bit of preparation. We've had the mayor here to unveil a new plaque, and we're just doing it by the gate over there. So if you can be there at 2, that'd be lovely. Thanks. Good to see you. Not at all. You're not in the way anywhere. Let me know when you're ready.
Okay, because we do. What I'll do is I'll move across because
Yes.
I can't see the buttons in the sunshine.
Is that better?
That's much better, but then I'll move over that way and
too bright.
get this in the background.
Right.
Okay, so once I've introduced you, just turn around, face that way, and then we'll carry on talking anyway about what today's event was, and obviously you want any volunteers, aren't you?
Trying to remember what the date is. It's May the 8th, isn't it? That's right.
Yeah.
Gary.
It's a handy little place, isn't it? Has it always been there? I would imagine so.
Sorry?
Has this always been here?
Yes, this
I
is
would
the vault
imagine.
where they used to put the coffins
Yeah.
on the stone slabs there. If they came, thank you very much. If they came the day before the funeral, they put them in there because it's cool.
Mm.
But obviously we use them now for
I
storing.
thought the boat was the storing place with the
No,
relics of the chapel.
no, we.
That's just for services.
Yes, yeah. That's where the service was.
Probably not.
No.
You haven't been, have you?
I've been here for ages now.
Taking off Spain out at work. Oh. My son's moved to Spain.
Is it? What about?
Teachers.
Oh yeah.
Outside.
South Carolina.
Yeah, he's been back and he's taken his dad out for about 5 weeks to give me a break, which was great.
How long's been away then? How long's his partner been away?
He went for 5 weeks.
No, how long's he been there?
Oh,
How's he come back?
12 months. Yeah.
No, your son went for 5 weeks.
No, my
Your
son-
husband went for 5 weeks.
My husband went for 5 weeks.
The
My son lives there.
question is, how long's your partner been there? He could be come back after 5 weeks.
Yes.
Right.
No, he came back. Yeah.
All good things come to an end.
Which is the largest in the cemetery, where the Crossleys of Dean Clough were buried, particularly the 3 sons who were responsible for getting the main mechanisation of carpet making at Dean Clough going from 1850. They were John, who's represented in that side, Joseph represented in the centre, and Francis on this side. John, 4 times Mayor of Halifax, a politician, also an MP for Halifax. Centrally here we have Joseph, who was responsible for running the company. He was not really involved with public life. Over here, Sir Francis, who was MP for the West Riding and for the northern parts of the West Riding, as well as MP for Halifax, all different times, a little earlier than John. So there were some politicians, they were all liberals in their politics in Halifax in those days when they were representing the town. And we have Sir Francis on his own, his wife's name, Joseph with a lot of children, John with children, and also some descendants who are commemorated here. You know, I said that the cemetery was closed in 1963. Well, there's some who died after who are commemorated there. Some of you may have known, in fact, some of you may have known Nick Crossley or Charles Crossley, who were around until not that many years ago. They're commemorated there at the decision of their family, permission was granted by the council, and we were happy about that. So it does continue, that tradition. We have a large vault, not over ostentatious. It's not like some of those you might see up at Undercliff in Bradford, but it's 12 sections around, so 6 and 6 if I remember rightly, separate commemorating panels and a bit of decoration. The second generation of the Crossleys were important too, but I'm not going to go into that now, but some of them are buried here as well. What I want to highlight while we are here is a stone over this side. Some of you may want to move if you want to see it. When I was doing the advertising for this open day, I circulated a picture of a man and a woman who looked like this, and their names are Thakrar Mills and his wife Jane. And Thakrar Mills and his wife Jane, they were married from High Sunderland, that wonderful house above Halifax, above the Godley Cutting, right up on the edge of the moors, which of course Emily Bronte is very widely thought to have used as a guide for her description of Wuthering Heights, of the house in Wuthering Heights. So at a time when Emily Bronte was in the area teaching at South Aram at Law Hill, this couple here were some of the tenants. They were not the owners, because the owners were more wealthy. In fact, at that time, the owner of the property there was William Priestley, who was Anne Walker of Gentleman Jack's cousin. He owned High Sunderland, but they were some of the tenants at High Sunderland. They moved eventually into Halifax, but Thakrar founded the mills down near Stony Royd Cemetery, which are known as the, I'm trying to think of the name, it's gone from me now, the mills on the way to Siddle anyway, down at the bottom there on the left, which have been gone. No, not quite as far as that. Not quite as far as that. The name's gone from me. It'll come back to me any second, Angela. Pardon my... I should have more notes with me, shouldn't I? I do too much from memory. I have got a few Aids memoir in my bag, but not that one. So that they were our connection with High Sunderland. As we walk round the cemetery on my tour, we will come round eventually to a row of tombstones right at the bottom, which originally were at Square Chapel and which were rescued in 2015, when they were going to be taken up to Stony Royd and destroyed. So along there we shall find the tombstone of the father of Thakrar Mills and the mother. So that's an example of how tombstones can move and can be relocated to sections of town where they are relevant, because the son's buried here, the father isn't buried here, but his tombstone is now right at the bottom. So he's come to join his son, although they have to shout rather hard before they can say anything. And we have the remains of a chapel, which was functional down to the 1940s or 50s at least. It was an independent chapel like they often are in cemeteries or at crematoria, and it was in position by the time the cemetery opened in the 1840s, and it was for the smaller type of funeral. The wealthy people would tend very much to be inclined to have a church funeral at their own church or chapel, and then they'd just be brought up here for the interment and a few words. The tradition was for the hearses to come in from Lister Lane like we've come in today. They would be mainly horse-drawn hearses. We don't know exactly. We believe that perhaps some of the poor people may have even been carried in on biers or something like that. And perhaps on simpler forms of transport, maybe even carts. We don't know all the details. But that was the route they came in, and they would the coffin would be deposited and taken to the grave if it was going direct, or taken into the chapel for the funeral. Sadly, in the lack of use for the chapel and the lack of use for the cemetery, and when the cemetery fell on bad times, eventually the roof fell in. After a number of years, the council made it stable, and they moved some of the stone that was in danger of tumbling and put it here. These are all part of the drainage on this side. They're huge chunks of stone. Think about how much effort would have been used to get to move all that. What did they use? Did they use different layers of wood to get it up there? I don't know. But this was part of the along this edge, though you can see some of them are hollowed and some of them are carved, and the hollows are where the water would drain away as a sort of gutter. Very elaborate, beautifully carved, some of them. Not quite sure we're ever going to quite get them back where they were. Thank you very much. The beehives belong to the basement project, the substance abuse support people. They wanted a location for their bees, and we said, oh yes, we'd be glad to have them here. They can be locked away safely. Bees are a bit under threat now. People even try and nick bees, I'm told. So they're safe behind there, we trust, and they're useful for pollinating and creating some of the colour you see around you. This side of the chapel here, Eli Bates, he's the only founder of this cemetery who was buried here. He was in fact a worshipper at Harrison Road Congregational Chapel, which has been Carlton United Reformed Church for a number of years. He was a founder member then, and when that chapel was founded there wasn't going to be any sort of graveyard around it, so he was very keen to found a cemetery a little bit further away where his mates could be buried and where he could be buried eventually himself. The other two founders were the father of Colonel Aykroyd, Jonathan Aykroyd, of up at Woodside near Haley Hill, and he was eventually buried down in town at the Methodist churchyard, and Colonel Aykroyd of course had him moved up to the mausoleum on Haley Hill on the All Souls churchyard, which of course tragically had to be demolished, wrongly in my opinion, in the 1960s. So he was a Methodist, and the third of the founders was a Unitarian, and he vanished, he disappeared down to Gloucestershire and was buried down there. So we just have Eli Bates, who was a founder here. Halifax, the big textile company, I don't know whether any of you do, but John Standeven over there was the father of the man who founded that business, and they were big in Halifax until the 1960s, big textile merchants. They're based in Old Lane, a bit beyond where Dean Clough is. Over the years since 2013, we've had a number of information boards put in, along with a number of seats. We had a lottery grant initially, and we've had other smaller grants since in order to enhance what we have here. When we started out in 2013, there was no information board even outside the gate to tell you what this was. So we had boards put outside, we had a few put in. The information board we came past near the gate, which some of you may have seen, the second one, commemorating the Halifax Building Society founders, that came a bit later. So we have a bit of information on site now, a few places for people to sit down, and we've also developed the green environment with a number of shrubs and plants, as you will see, and trees too, as we will notice as we go. Moving. Now, who can you imagine would want to carve stone into the shape of wood? It does seem a little bit strange, but somebody was determined to, as we can see here. We also have an anchor which represents faith with the cross, and we have chambers. How many of you know James Chambers, the timber merchants up Pelham Lane on the corner of Queen's Road? This is the father, William McClellan Chambers, whose name appears here. He was the father of James Chambers, who founded that business. James Chambers took that business on the corner of Queen's Road in the very early 20th century. His father had died some years before, but his father had also been a timber merchant. And this is what makes us believe that this was the reason for carving a tree trunk. You know, he made his money from wood. Well, why didn't he have a wooden memorial? No, probably wouldn't have lasted, would it? As we walk around the cemetery, you may notice a few of these crosses which we placed. They don't all look identical, but something like this with a poppy on them. And the idea was to commemorate those who are commemorated here, not all of whom, of course, are buried here, who fell in the Great War. We started a scheme during the centenary, and we've had a number of poppy events here, particularly in 2018 centenary. So that commemorates a chap who was buried over in Flanders, but whose family had him commemorated here. It matters, and I'm talking to the dandelions, not to you. We think we do, really. It's a bit of a job to keep them under control. They are very pretty when they're flowering, but I'm not sure afterwards. And getting the roots out, if you want to, is not terribly easy. As you can see, this top end of the cemetery has a vast number of ornate graves. The memorials would have cost a lot more up this end than those we shall see further down. But it doesn't mean that the people down the bottom were any less interesting. They all have a story to tell. We only know some of them. If we look across at the back, behind here, you can see two matching draped urns. And you might just about be able to see Jessie, wife of John Whitley. And that was one, there were matching vaults, two matching vaults of the Whitley family vault. There were two different branches of the Whitley family. There was Nathan Whitley, who lived in Park Road, who ran the mills the other side of King Cross Street, the Brunswick Mills, and also Hanson Lane Mills. Brunswick was textiles, Hanson Lane was cotton. And that commemorates that family, who intermarried with the Crossley sort of greater family, all nonconformists who worship down at Square Chapel and Square Church. They're a bit difficult to get to, so I'll mention them rather distantly this time. But the Whitley family, of course, also gave us the J.H. Whitley, who was the Speaker of the House of Commons, the Member of Parliament for Halifax after the First World War, and then Speaker of the House of Commons, and finally Chairman of the Board of Governors of the BBC. And his son was a man who's commemorated in the college over there, Percival Whitley. There's a commemoration of the Speaker Whitley on this memorial, but he isn't actually buried here, it's just a memorial to him. And his son Percival, I think, was buried up at Worley Cemetery, if I remember rightly, up on the Worley hillside. Somebody who fell in the Great War, this time on the Italian front. We often forget, perhaps, that there was an Italian front during the First World War. We think about Western Europe, we might even think about Africa, but I'm not sure we think very much about the Allies fighting down in Italy against the Austro-Hungarians. I'm talking about a spot here which is marked by this cross. There is no memorial to this person I'm going to speak about. So towards the end of 1870, William Crabtree, who was a widower, had a shop in Waterhouse Street. It's in part of that building which was latterly known as Crown House, a sort of gift shop, and then became, I think it's some kind of a cafe more recently. As you come along towards Commercial Street, the property is still there. He had a shop, he was a printer, and also he was a bookseller. Now, what happened to him? One night in December 1870, he was in bed and his younger son was sleeping in the room with him when somebody attacked him. I'm circulating a sheet with a very melodramatic picture or print taken from a very old police magazine from the 19th century, and the property is at one side. So what happened to William was he was basically battered to death with something that is thought to have been like an axe. His younger son, who was in the room with him, saw the intruder in the dim light but could not identify him. The only other person on the premises was the older son, who was called Walter Crabtree, and so he was the prime suspect, although he had no blood on him, and he was found almost immediately after the attack. William Crabtree was buried here following an inquest. Walter Crabtree was arrested and taken to Leeds to be tried for murder. But there was not enough evidence to convict him, because they said that a side door to the shop could have been unlocked and an intruder could have got in. Most people locally thought that Walter Crabtree did it. They didn't know how he got away with it, but there was no conviction possible. So Walter he wasn't exonerated, but he wasn't convicted, so he was let go. There were some later members of the Crabtree family buried in this plot here, but there's never been any memorial to them. You're able to see a rather broken tombstone, which was originally standing on this plinth. Clearly it fell down at some stage, but additionally it must have been deliberately broken, and this is what we see today. My colleague Stuart, who's leading the other group, he found pieces of this tombstone a little way up there, and he found just about all of it. It looks as if it had almost been damaged deliberately, whether it was to do with vandalisation when the cemetery was unattended, or whether there was a programme, because we found other broken tombstones that look as if they've been done deliberately, whether there was a programme at one stage to begin to break up some of the stones here, which we don't know about, has to be a possibility. But we do reconstruct and we rediscover things, as you see here. Overgrown, I should have done some more mowing, and we're going to find the beginning of that row of stones which came from Square Chapel, which was rescued in 2014-2015 with the support and consent of the council, and also the support of the Calderdale Family History Society, who are very keen to preserve information on tombstones. It so happens that the tombstones down at Square Chapel are rather more valuable than some, because the burial registers for Square Chapel Square Church from 1837 have been lost, and there were burials there right up to very few, but burials up to towards the end of the 19th century. So some of these stones probably contain information not easily discoverable elsewhere. Heights. You may just have to lift your foot over a lip, so be very careful. I don't want anybody falling over them. We have got insurance, but I don't want any claims. So the stones upon which you're walking don't represent any burials underneath. They're on, I say pristine ground as far as I know. And that many of them are a lot older than what we have in this cemetery. Some date right the way back to the 1790s. So some of them are really 40 or 50 years older than this cemetery itself. So they're not associated with any bodies that are here with us today. Before I talk about those stones though, this is the stone with the earliest commemoration of a burial here in August 1842. And it commemorates the burial of Maria Baxendale. She's the first person to have a memorial in this cemetery. I'm not saying this stone was made in 1842, nor was it the first burial, but it's the first burial with a date after the cemetery was founded. So we'll move along the stones carefully. So we have quite an ornate double pair of stones here. One says Greenwood and Simpson, and the other says McVine. The family of McVine, they were of Scottish origin, as you might imagine. And they were involved with the wine trade, which is a rather suitable trade for somebody whose name is McVine, I'm sure you will agree. I could mention a number of men in this cemetery, I'm afraid it is all men, who are buried here, who were founders of the Halifax Building Society, the Halifax Permanent Building Society in particular. William McVine was one of them, and I'm ashamed to say we haven't done our litter picking very well, or he would be a little bit tidier looking. William McVine, an interesting character. His wife died, she's buried here, several of his children are buried here. And then he decided he'd get married again to someone the age of his children. And he fell out with all his children, so he moved away and he lived in the Isle of Man. And that's where he ended his life. And he wasn't buried here as he planned, but many of his family were. A particular stone, which is just along here, which you can have a look at as we pass. At the top of the cemetery, I showed you that picture of Thackeray Mills and his wife. Can't find it again now, who were married from High Sunderland, and this is the gravestone from Square Chapel of his father, James Mills, and it mentions the residence at High Sunderland and other members of the family, including an infant son of the son Thackeray Mills, so it links Square Chapel and the stones from there which might have been lost, with the burial of Thackrah Mills right up at the top next to the Crossleys. But my next port of call will be this stone here. I'll just wait for a few more to catch up. So at the bottom here we have a retaining wall that's quite tall, and the original lie of this land would have been about 6 feet lower or more. So this was all raised when they created the cemetery. So this is from the parish register, the marriage entry of Peter Kenyon Holden and his wife, who are commemorated here, not buried here. And Peter Kenyon Holden was very significant in the printing and literary history of Halifax, because he was the printer of Patrick Bronte's first 2 volumes of poetry. When Patrick was a curate over at Hart's Head, he had 2 volumes of poetry printed. They were called Cottage Poems and the Rural Minstrel. The details are there. Please feel free to circulate. The name of P.K. Holden is near the bottom. Peter Kenyon Holden, he married twice, I think. This is his first wife, his parents-in-law and such like. So when we discovered this, we were really quite pleased, because this could have been lost, and although Patrick Bronte has nothing like the stature of his descendants, his children and so on, in literary fame, he did write verse himself, and he is well known. And this was his first printer, commemorated here. So Peter Kenyon Holden is not actually buried here. He's one of our links with Undercliff Cemetery at Bradford. He's buried there with the Biles family. And one of the descendants of Peter Kenyon Holden in the female line was the Roman Catholic Father Biles, who went down with the Titanic in 1912 and is commemorated in Bradford as well. So this was the first printer of the senior Bronte generation. Ordinary stone here commemorating Henry Wadsworth, whose name appears some way down. Some of you will know of the Orange Box in Halifax near the Peace Hall entrance at the top end, and that was built by Henry Wadsworth as his cart works in the late 19th century, and above part of the structure today, which of course was later on to be a potato warehouse, that was the cart manufactory of Wadsworth, and his initials HW and the date can be seen above the old entrance in Thomas Street, if you care to have a look sometime. He was married to the daughter of the couple who are mentioned across here. So he was buried next to his in-laws. If you don't like the idea of getting away from your in-laws, what do you like? We go across here next. Careful on the slope. So we're looking across Lister Lane here. Again, you remember what I said about the earth being pushed down to the bottom of the cemetery with that much higher. And we look across to Sir Francis Crossley's house, the back of it, originally known as Bellevue and completed in 1857. So when he died in 1872, he had hardly any distance to go to be buried. So what they did, because they wanted people to sort of salute him, they arranged for the cortege, that's the funeral party and the hearse, to go zigzagging around the streets over here, backwards and forwards, and come into the cemetery backwards up there and across this way. It was all done for effect. There was also considerable importance in the fact that there had been a memorial service or a funeral service in the church across there, the Congregational Church. So that was where Sir Francis lived. We can't see it to its best advantage. Ian, you were on the walk yesterday, weren't you? And we walked around this part of Halifax and looked at the front of it. So in the 1880s, the Crossleys sold this property off and it became a museum and a library. Some of you might remember it when there was a library at the back end here, a library down to 1983, as recent as that. So that moved down to town, the new Central Library opened, of course, now replaced by a much later library. So this is where Sir Francis Crossley lived, and we can just glimpse his very fine almshouses, although we see them from behind. It looks like a castle tower almost, beautifully ornate Gothic style, completed in 1855, before the house was built. And of course Sir Francis gave People's Park to Halifax, which is over the other side of his residence. We're going up this side. We mustn't get muddled up with the other group or I'll get into trouble. Side of this path, we had this planted since 2013 with small grants, with shrubs. It's not perfect, but we're turning it to a sort of, you know, it's quite attractive, a bit sporadic. We've had a few bits that didn't quite take and need replacing or have died off, but we're doing our best. We're in the north of Halifax Parish Church, today's Halifax Minster. Used to stand an old building called the Moot Hall. You may have seen pictures of it. It was demolished back in 1957, I think it was, where law and order had been dished out from the Middle Ages right the way down to the 18th century. There'd been courts held there, mini courts really. In that house, when it was converted to other purposes, lived the Briggs family. And there's two graves here which commemorate the Briggs, and they were carpenters and funeral directors. I knew about them from reading about this building for many years. I had absolutely no idea where they were buried. I just assumed because they lived right next to the parish churchyard, they must be buried there, or at least some of them were. But I was quite wrong. They were Congregationalists, so they didn't choose to be buried there, and they were buried up here. And these commemorate that family. You know, you think they must be buried alongside. They're doing the funerals, they must be buried there, but they weren't. They had to be buried here. So various members of the Briggs family. And I'm just going to turn the newest information board put in last year, and we had a cloth over it for the mayor to just pull off today when he planted the tree. So this is pretty new, and my colleague Stuart designed it and chose what would go on it. The idea was to commemorate how the Victorians celebrated funerals and death. It's not specific about some things, but in other cases it is. There were even shops in Halifax which celebrated selling mourning materials. Big signs up saying, get your funeral kit here, basically, which sounds bizarre today, doesn't it? And you've got some examples here, and you've got a Halifax advertiser, Henry Crabtree, not buried here, but he probably took part in some of the burials here, and you can get an idea of some of the types of carriages and hearses that were in use back in the slightly later than the middle. I think it was the 1860s this dates on. And short lives. The Victorians lived with death all around them in a way we don't today. So many children died in infancy. If we wanted to be heartbroken, we just looked through the database of all those buried here who died between, well, there were some stillbirths too, but between the age of a day old, less than a day old, and when does infancy end? 5, 10. The number is absolutely phenomenal. So we got Edward Aked. He was the keeper of the swimming baths on the corner of Park Road, the bottom end of the park over there. And he and his wife looked after that emporium, whatever you call it, in its early years. It was opened in 1859, and one of the jobs he had to do was to keep an eye on the water. Every 2 days he had to change all the water in the swimming pool. There wasn't just one, there were 4 pools, 2 big pools, one for men, one for women, and 2 smaller pools, and there were other washing facilities. I don't know how he did it. Not a lot of urination, I trust. Pardon my French there. Anyway, they had to change the water regularly, and that was every 2 days. It must have been an astonishing task. It must have poured in and poured out. Where did it go to, the old water? Did it pour down to the bottom of the town, go down the drain? Who knows? We'll go down a little.
Sorry.
It's absolutely fine, Andrew, don't worry. This is a stone we had put in 2014. If you want to go around the front, that's fine. There's a seat at the bottom if anyone wants to pop down and sit down. You might be able to hear me, it's up to you. So this was put in when we had some money given in commemoration of Adrian Smith, who's mentioned at the bottom, who was a very hard worker on this site, Adrian Smith. member of the wire-making smiths down at Charlestown Road, but it commemorates a veteran of the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. So Adrian knew about this man. We'd researched him, and he was very bothered that this man didn't have a proper stone. First of all, we planted a shrub here to commemorate its site because we knew it from the plans and the records of the cemetery. But then, when Adrian died and left some money, we decided to have a stone put in to commemorate this guy. And you can see his name there, Daniel Milton. Now, he was not from this part of the world originally. He came from Devon. He fought at Waterloo and came up to Halifax later. And he died eventually, having worked latterly at, we think, at Crossley's Carpets, certainly for a carpet manufacturer. He died up at Range Bank above Haley Hill at quite an advanced age. So why didn't he have a stone? Well, this area of the cemetery, and not just this area of the cemetery, there are other areas where there are no stones, but particularly in this section here, we have a lot of the burials of people who had, what shall we say, pauper burials. They were the poor people who couldn't really afford anything, and there were funds available for a basic ceremony and a basic burial. And it was very basic. You couldn't choose where you were buried. His wife was buried in another plot nearby. And if you look at that memorial very closely, you'll say we mentioned that there were 29 others buried just in that one plot. That's 30 people in sort of less than 3 feet by 6'6". It is almost unimaginable how that was done, but we won't go into the detail or worry about it too much. So there's a lot of these graves across this section here where there are no memorials. And well, we can't do much about the others, but we thought we'd have this stone erected, and we had the money available. And then in 2015, 7 years ago, we had a little sort of celebration of the Battle of Waterloo in June of 2015. And when we had a celebration, we had the mayor here, and we had a few other commemorations of men around here who served with Wellington, who died in Halifax later on. So that's Daniel Milton, died in poverty, as a lot of old soldiers did and probably still do. And we shouldn't remember that, we shouldn't forget them. But we shouldn't forget hundreds of others who are dotted around, buried here, in graves with almost dozens in them. It's incredible, isn't it? It's sad to think. But anyway, we commemorated him because he was an old soldier. He fought his regiment, as you can see, if you look there, it says 95th. I don't know how many of you are aficionados of the TV series Sharp, but Sharp was in the 95th Regiment. Of course, Sharp was only Sean Bean. He wasn't a real soldier like this was. Life that includes foxes. Perhaps for the dog's sake, I better do it here. So we can see little tracks that they create, and they decide, I want to make an earth underneath that grave there. And they decide from year to year where they're going to go. Sometimes it's over that side, whether they're different families, I don't know. I haven't seen any this year, and I don't think I saw any last year, but occasionally when I've been here at dusk, I've seen them, and we've seen cubs around too. I know they do have their negative links, but I thought I'd just show you that. And again here, if you look, you can see there's been some digging. So please don't fall down because I won't be able to get you out. We only know some of them, and we'll never know more than a fraction perhaps. But here we have 3 graves next to one another of considerable interest, and these came to light following the discovery that we had another Waterloo veteran, another man who'd fought at Waterloo, who was buried here much later. And this all came to light from contact by a chap out in Australia, who's now a member of our friends group, and who's actually been to the cemetery and brought with him his ancestor's silver Waterloo medal, which is really quite remarkable. A few years ago he brought it along on site, and we were delighted. Robert Nutter, who's mentioned here, born in Halifax, unlike Mr. Milton over there, who was born in Devon. This was a Halifax man through and through, who was wounded at Waterloo. He was with the Blues, he was with the Horse Guards, therefore, wounded at Waterloo, retired from the army, came back and became a weaver in Halifax, and he died in one of the streets a little bit 2 blocks away up there many years later. And had that man not got in touch with us, we'd probably have picked up on it eventually, because we've been doing quite a lot of research. But we hadn't known about Robert Nutter. We then knew that we had 2 to commemorate in 2015, and the 200th anniversary of Waterloo, which was nice. Commemorates a man who had rather a lot of wives. If you look very carefully, starts off with a little child, and if you read it carefully, eventually you get to the man himself. His name was Sam Batty Mann, and there are 4 wives listed there, one after the other. What was he up to, I asked myself. We have had a little look. Stuart said we better check in case he was trying to get the insurance money. Well, I don't think people were trying to get the insurance money quite like they did later in the days when Sam was alive. However, Stuart had a look at the research and he didn't find that the families were very wealthy, so he didn't think it was, as a result, anything to do with trying to get his wives money out of them. The flowers that you see there is, if you come and look at it, talks about a little boy called Joe, J-O. I'll go around this way, it's probably easier. So if I read it out, he was aged 4 years, 8 months. And he was the son of Job and Emma of this town, and who, on returning from school on the 24th of May 1860, was instantly killed by a fall of planks carelessly piled in Delft Street. Not the debtors' jail you might think of if you know about Halifax debtors' jail down in Jail Lane. That ceased operations in the 1840s, and another jail was opened up Hanson Lane in the 1840s, which survived until about 1880, and the keeper was John Marchant. And one of the people he looked after in that jail was Joseph Bentley Leyland, who was the most eminent Halifax sculptor of the early 19th century, a very close friend of Branwell Bronte, who paid Branwell Bronte's debts on several occasions, and he died in the debtors' jail. You probably know that Branwell Bronte was getting into problems financially. It was featured in Sally Wainwright's film and such like, and of course in many of the factual books too. So all these men, even those who had employment as sculptors, could get into financial problems. And sadly, Joseph Bentley Leyland died in the custody of this chap, Mr. Marchant. Leyland himself was buried down in town in the old Salem churchyard or chapel yard. Of course, that was completely removed in the 1970s and the stones broken up. This is why I felt it was so important to try and save as many stones as we can that might be damaged or broken up in the accident caused to the little boy by all those planks which were carelessly placed and fell on him.
Was it common for people to write that kind of thing on graves if it was...
I think they had to have a certain state of mind, but I'm not absolutely sure. But you have a look at this one. What we're told here, Joseph Wordsworth, you are told a tremendous lot about him. He wasn't native to Halifax, he came from York, but it appears he came to work on a triumphal arch to commemorate the marriage of Queen Victoria's eldest son, the Prince of Wales, to Alexandra of Denmark. And it says his death was caused by a fall from the triumphal march while engaged in the erection in Crown Street, Halifax. And it goes on to say his friends paid for the memorial. So whoever his friends were, they had some, they made quite a nice ornate memorial to their chappie who fell off the scaffolding or whatever it was. Happened all too common in days before health and safety, I'm sure. Look how tall the stones are. They're all almost our height, and when you think that they would need to be embedded in the ground as well, these were not just little stones, were they? Most of them, I mean, there are some smaller ones, and the later ones tended to be smaller, but there was always plenty of stone around Halifax, of course, on the moors up above, both up above Wainstalls, up on Ringby and up on Beacon Hill and so on. Lots of sources of stone which would have been brought down quite easily compared with having to get them from, as they would have done in some areas. Look also at how beautifully the stone has survived. The detail is almost as good as it was the day it was carved. A lot of the stones, of course, have darkened with time, pollution, industrial, I suppose, to some extent, but they've survived well. If you compare them with some tombstones in other churchyards and cemeteries around the country, of even newer date, these are remarkably good. And that's the hard